History is packed with names that echo through the centuries. But honestly, very few individuals go through a transformation so massive that it literally alters the course of human civilization. So let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolutely extraordinary life of Umar ibn Al-Khattab. We're talking about a man whose journey took him from being one of the most terrifying opponents of a new faith to becoming its legendary protector. Under his leadership, a movement that started in the remote deserts of Arabia exploded into one of the most powerful civilizations the world has ever seen. But as you'll see, his true legacy wasn't actually about conquest at all. It was about an unyielding, almost unbelievable commitment to justice and deep humility. To really get inside his head, just think about this quote for a second. If even a dog dies of hunger on the banks of the Euphrates, Omar will be responsible for it. Wow. The sheer weight of that accountability is just staggering, right? This wasn't some modern politician trying to score points. This was the ruler of a vast global empire, genuinely terrified that God would hold him personally accountable for a starving animal thousands of miles away from his capital. This ultimate obsession with justice totally defined his rule. But to figure out how he reached this incredible level of empathy, we kind of have to step back in time and see exactly where he started out.
Part 1, the Dark Era and the Antagonist.
Okay, so to really understand him, we have to travel back to 6th century Arabia. Omar was born into the powerful Quraysh tribe during a time often called the Dark Ages, and it earned that name for a reason. This was a society driven by idolatry, intense tribalism, and just endless bloody warfare. Basically, the law of the strong ruled absolute, and the weak, they had virtually no rights. It was a brutal, brutal era where social injustices were the norm, and heartbreakingly, many families would literally bury their newborn daughters alive. Making the leap from that kind of dark, unforgiving society to the state of strict ethical codes and protections for the vulnerable that he'd eventually build, it's just staggering.
So how exactly did this harsh environment forge him? Well, Umar had a really tough upbringing. His father, Khattab ibn Nufail, was a remarkably stern man who made young Umar herd camels in the punishing, extreme heat of the desert for hours on end. But this grueling work actually taught him incredible patience and endurance. As he grew up, he became physically imposing. He was highly skilled in wrestling, horseback riding, and martial arts. But here's the thing, he wasn't just muscle. He was actually one of the very few people in a society who was educated, and he used that sharp intellect to become a highly successful merchant, earning a massive amount of respect among the elites of Mecca.
Part 2, the turning point. Which brings us to arguably the most dramatic moment in this entire history. How does a fierce enemy suddenly become a legendary defender? See, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, began preaching Islam, the leaders of the Quraysh went into a total panic. They saw this new faith as a direct threat to their power, their economy, and all their ancient traditions. And Umar? Fiercely protective of Arabian tradition, he became one of the absolute harshest persecutors of the early Muslims. His rage just kept building until it reached a boiling point. One day, he actually grabs his sword and marches right through the streets of Mecca with a single crystal-clear intention. He was going to assassinate the Prophet. But on his way there, someone intercepts him and drops a bombshell. His own sister, Fatima, had secretly converted to Islam. Furious, Umar completely changes course and storms over to his sister's house. He bursts through the door, super aggressive and violent at first. But eventually, he demands to read the verses they were reciting. And as he reads the holy words of Surah Taha, something completely incredible happens. The words literally touched his heart. The man who had just walked in trembling with murderous rage was profoundly moved. His anger just melts away, and he immediately goes directly to the Prophet. But not to kill him, to embrace the very faith he had just sworn to wipe out. The impact of his conversion hit Mecca like an earthquake. Seriously, before Umar, Muslims had to pray in secret, just out of sheer fear for their lives. But Umar wasn't a guy who hid in the shadows. He openly led the Muslims right to the Kaaba to pray in broad daylight. This incredible show of courage earned him a very specific title from the Prophet, Al-Farooq. It means the distinguisher between truth and falsehood. And this wasn't just some catchy nickname. It perfectly defined his absolute, uncompromising moral clarity for the rest of his life. And if you want to really grasp his unshakable courage, just look at his migration from Mecca to Medina, known as the Hijra. While most early Muslims had to sneak out of the city in the dead of night to avoid being murdered by the Quraysh, Umar did the exact opposite.
He straps on his sword, walks right up to the Kaaba, and announces to his enemies, "Let him who wants to make his mother childless stand in my way." He literally migrated in broad daylight. And guess what? Not a single person dared to stop him.
Part 3. The Architect of an Empire. Over the next several years, Umar was this constant pillar of support throughout the Prophet's life, and then during the rule of the first Caliph, Abu Bakr. But when he stepped into the role of the second Caliph in 634 CE, he was handed the massive task of managing a rapidly exploding state. And he didn't just rule it, he built pioneering institutions from scratch. He created the Baytul Mal, a central state treasury, to make sure public funds were actually managed for the welfare of the people. He established a truly independent judiciary, completely totally separate from the executive branch. He set up a formal police system for public order, divided the vast lands into organized administrative regions with accountable governors, and even created formal army registration. Guys, these were the foundational systems for modern governance, built centuries ahead of their time. And honestly, these systems were desperately needed because the empire was growing at breakneck speed. During his 10-year rule, we see this massive era of conquest. Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and the mighty Persian Empire all came under Muslim rule. Right in the middle of all this was the highly significant conquest of Jerusalem. But notice how we have to interpret this. Despite this unprecedented expansion, Omar never ever allowed arrogance to creep in. His primary goal wasn't just territorial conquest, it was the expansion of a justice-based state.
Part 4. The Servant Leader and Unparalleled Justice.
Let's think about that Jerusalem conquest for a second. When the Christian leaders agreed to surrender the city, they insisted on handing the keys directly to Omar. So how does he show up? Not with some grand royal parade, no. He wore patched clothes and shared a single camel with his servant. This extreme humility defined his daily life back in his capital, too. He actually made a habit of conducting these night patrols, roaming the dark streets, personally looking for anyone who was hungry or vulnerable. One night, a patrol led him to this absolutely heartbreaking scene. A starving family where a desperate mother was literally boiling plain water in a pot, just to trick her crying children into thinking food was on the way.
Visibly shaken by this, Umar immediately rushed back to the state treasury, loaded up a massive sack of flour and food, and hoisted it right onto his own back. When his assistant jumped in and offered to carry the heavy sack for him, Umar refused. He asked him this devastating question: "Will you carry my burden on the day of judgment?" He carried that heavy sack himself, cooked the food for the family himself, and didn't leave until those kids were fed and smiling. I mean, that is the literal epitome of servant leadership.
And this really highlights the ultimate paradox of his life. On one hand, he's the ruler of a vast global empire, commanding massive armies and unimaginable wealth. But on the other hand, his daily reality was sleeping safely outside under a tree, in clothes covered in patches. In fact, foreign envoys who came to meet the Caliph were routinely shocked. They expected lavish palaces and heavily armed guards. Instead, they find the most powerful man in the world just taking a nap in the dust. One envoy famously observed, "You have ruled justly, so you sleep safely." Because he treated his people with absolute fairness, he literally had nothing to fear from them. Part 5. Martyrdom and Enduring Legacy. Sadly, the profound peace Umar enjoyed couldn't protect him from treachery. In 644 CE, an assassin struck him multiple times with a poisoned knife during morning prayers. But what's truly revealing is how he reacted in those final moments. Even on his deathbed, suffering from fatal wounds, he wasn't crying over lost wealth or lost power, because he had none. His only concern was the future, the stability of the society, and making sure there was a fair process to choose the next leader so his people wouldn't fall into chaos. Up until his very last breath, he proved he was history's ultimate servant leader. Which leaves us with a final, really provocative question to think about. Does true historical power come from endless conquest, or does it come from absolute justice and selfless service to humanity? Umar's life completely challenges our modern definitions of success, proving that the absolute highest form of authority isn't found in domination, but in service. His blueprint for ethical leadership is profoundly relevant to our world today, and I highly encourage you to dive deeper into the sources and study his life further. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time as we unpack another incredible piece of history.